Well, welcome to part two. Let's jump right on in and cover a few more of these slides. We've got a long way to go and a short time to get there. And this is the second half of what every leader needs to know about the board, how to build a better board. We'll go over some of these points. We're going to talk about mission and vision first. And one of the things that happens when people get into this subject is they sometimes confuse their vision of the future and their mission for doing things right now. And so you get to kind of going in circles, and traveling in circles is almost sure to wind up making you dizzy. So the analogy I like to use to help people not get dizzy is think in terms of these skaters out in ice skating, and even ballerinas who are able to do it somewhat in ballet, but particularly in ice skating. You see them go into a pirouette, and as I recall, the term from physics is a conservation of energy, the spin momentum. As they start spinning and pull their arms in closer together, they actually start spinning faster and faster. The question is, how do they keep from getting as drunk as a skunk doing that? And the answer is rather fascinating. Your balance is controlled there in your inner ear largely by those fluids. And if you'll notice what most of those people are doing, number one, they've practiced a great deal, and that is fundamental. But then they do a thing called spotting. And so they'll start that spin and they'll pick a point out on the distance, and they'll lock their eyesight on that. And as they spin around, just like an old hoot owl, they'll move their head around to stay with that spot until they get to the point where they have to whip their head around, and then they'll lock on that spot again. And they keep doing that as they're going around, and that momentary stop in being able to look at one point turns out to be the key. It's called spotting. Well, what's that got to do with us? Well, what it's got to do with us is our mission of knowing what it is that we are there. What is our deliverable? What is the thing? And so many times that winds up understanding what your mission is. The vision is the ideal world after it would look after you got your mission accomplished. The mission is an answer to the question, why do you exist? And according to at least some of the folks who have written about this, they point out that not only is it answering why you exist, but you try to start it with, our mission is to, and then a very short, clear statement. And usually where people get off is they try to start describing the organization, where what you really want is a distinct, succinct, ideally one sentence, sometimes two sentences at most, the sort of thing that always is clear. This gentleman I mentioned in Tufts University, whose feet I sat at that day, made a comment that he advises boards when they meet around the horseshoe table there, on the name placard, on the back of it, they should have that mission statement, so that every time they look up, their vision has to go right across. This is why we are here. And I've heard a lot of really good mission statements. I'll tell you, the hardest you'll work in a refocus and come up with something that focuses the energy of the organization and is owned and developed from the grassroots up the organization. Our business cards, and for quite some years I was appointed and worked on the state commission for Keep Arkansas Beautiful. And on the back of that, we had the mission statement for the national Keep America Beautiful and the mission statement for our state. Now, that was the mission after it had been refocused and refined. The old mission statement for Keep Arkansas Beautiful did not have the privilege of getting to be built the way a mission statement ideally is. And so a great friend of mine and wonderful man named Robert Phelps, he was the sole person, and he needed to write up, and he did, a mission statement. And that mission statement served well. It covered the three big areas. He's quite the wordsmith and writes so eloquently. It came to me pretty apparent, though, that if you ask folks on that commission what the mission was, most people could get around to the three big areas, but they could not put a hard edge on it. So after a lot of discussion and finally a long board retreat and a lot of hair pulling, we came up with a new mission statement. The new mission statement says inspiring and educating individuals to prevent litter, recycle, and keep Arkansas beautiful. Everything that's in that big mission statement is covered in those few words. But people can remember those few words, and it really puts a point on what we're there for. That's what mission statements do. Heifer International says to work with communities to end world hunger and poverty and care for the earth. Actually, this one kind of got fluffed out from something I saw written on the wall there years ago that really moved me. It said, helping hungry people feed their family and care for the earth. Now, if that won't make you reach for your billfold, then we're a lot further apart in values than I think we are. Isn't that great? Helping hungry people feed their family and care for the earth. Archer Daniels says to unlock the potential of nature and improve the quality of life. TED Talks has it down to two words: spreading ideas. I heard about a delivery company years ago. It wasn't UPS or FedEx, and they came up with two words: overnight delivery. They put it everywhere in the company, and they said, if you look up and see those two words, and if what you're doing is not getting that done, you're off mission. Isn't that great? Really planning ahead, and that means strategic planning. That's something that sort of scares people sometimes. Remember, vision is what the world would look like if the mission was completely fulfilled. Mission is why you are working to get to that. It's what you do. And I can't talk about this without giving a little pledge of appreciation and love to that great friend Ray Ledgerwood, my mentor and hero in conservation, because he took me aside one day and just as a gesture of care said, let me show you something about strategic planning. And he, on a piece of paper, drew out for me the power of three. He said, you got your vision, here's your mission. He said, what I tell folks is you've got all these goals in mind. He said, but I always press on what's the most important goal. If you could only get one thing done, what would it be? Well, after a lot of haranguing, they would finally come up with what everyone agreed, consensus-wise, was the number one goal. And he said, all right, now, if you could only slice off and get one thing done toward that goal, what would it be? And there you go with the big discussion. He says, after they finally concur to the number one objective that would move them toward the goal, he said, if you had a little more time and a little more money, I can see Ray saying this, he said, what would be the next objective that you try to accomplish? And then they would go to work on that. And you know what happens after that? Then they would go to work on three, and then he cut them off. And what I tell people is, if you don't have a Pentagon budget, you don't need a Pentagon plan. 3 goals, and each goal having 3 objectives. And of course, what happens then is you break it down. What would be the most important task toward that objective? The second most important, and the third. And you do that for all 3 objectives, and then you cut them off. And I've done strategic planning sessions with state agencies. And I remember on a couple of occasions, after they realized that, no, we're going to prioritize. We don't have a Pentagon budget. At least on 2 occasions, they stopped after 2. They said, if we can just focus and do those 2 things, we'll have done more than any other administration of this agency up to this time. What a concept, right? And so you see, if you had a little more time, more money, what would be the second goal? And a little bit of time and money, what would be the if you could only do one thing toward goal number 2, what would it be? Number 3, and right on down the line, and then you cut them off. 3 goals, each goal with 3 objectives, each objective with 3. The power of 3. Isn't that brilliant? Thank you, Ray Ledgerwood. You know, if you need good facilitation and coaching and hands-on, you can't do better than Ray Ledgerwood. He wrote the book. All right, so there's your strategic plan that moves you through the mission and to the vision. The guy at Tufts University carried this idea a little further whenever he said, look at it as the war analogy. You know, we live in a world where people are eager to be offended, and I'm sure someone, hopefully not too many people in Oklahoma, would be offended by something as violent as a war analogy, but I'm descended from Highlander Scots, so you know, I just take it for granted that it exists out there. So world peace is the vision, winning the war is the mission, and then you get your war council together and everyone has to fight it out, and then you mop up the blood because you finally decide what's the most important battle that we've got to win. If we lose here, we will lose the war. And once they decide what the most important battle is, it's the same thing. Well, if you had one objective, what would it be? And then there are 3 tasks under it. And if you could get a little bit more time and money to move you toward that goal, what would it be? And then you do the same thing with the third. And because the third's close to the line, I'll give you some examples. If on the third objective was to disrupt communications, you'd cut their landlines and their radios and their satellite jamming. And you see, you take one thing at a time, deploy smoke on the battlefield. Isn't that interesting? And you see how the tiers of mission and task gets broken down. At each level, you have a team working on it, and that becomes their number one mission, is to get that objective or to get that task. It's pretty straightforward. And now we get to 22 things that we'd like to fix about the board. And before we do, let me remind you, your number one job is to find problems and fix them early on. And that will make the hair stand right up on the back of your head sometimes. I am sure to share some things in the next few minutes that you won't like hearing. It's like opening the hood and hearing that mechanic say, uh-oh. You don't want to hear that. But you don't get mad at Benny Brantley because he tells you that. He always says, it's your truck. It's your truck. This is an illustration of taking care of problems. This was down over in Dubai. Those people have more money than they know what to do with. They were digging out the basement for this big high rise. If I zoomed in, you'd see what they saw was the problem. In their excavation, they had hit some kind of water source, but they were treating the symptom handily. They had a little borrow pit there and a pump, and they were pumping it out. They weren't really thinking about the big picture, though. And before many hours passed, the big picture became evident. They were excavating next to the sidewall of a channeled river going through town. And you know what happens with little leagues? You don't have a Dutch boy there. So now the good news is within an hour or two, everything was back to being calm. You just see the top of the crane sticking out. You know, in Arkansas, we have a lot of cranes around our pools too, but not kind. So what do we learn from that? Let's fix these things as we see them develop. And so here we go. I'm going to be your Benny Brantley. And number one thing is, boards that fail to realize they are responsible for the health and welfare and the future of the whole organization. They're in the driver's seat. And again, only one person's behind the wheel, but that's why you rotate who's behind the wheel. You're a stronger team if everyone's had a chance to manage the money, keep the records, drive the train. It's just responsibility. Number two, lots of boards have the mistaken understanding that they're volunteers because they don't draw a salary. They may get some expenses back, but you know what? Board members are not volunteers, particularly if they are not advisory boards. They're governance boards. They're office holders. Doesn't matter. that they were elected or appointed and not getting paid. Once you step over the threshold, you're an office holder. You know, we have an all volunteer army here, but it's not like you can have a bad day and decide you want to go home. Number three, a reluctance to rotate responsibilities within the board. It just stands to reason that the team is stronger when everyone in the team has had a chance to pass through and see what it means to keep up with fiscal responsibility, what it means to use the gavel, what it means to keep the records and to post the minutes. That's important. And if you don't actively set in motion something that causes that, it becomes real easy to just say, well, let's just kind of keep things like they are. I know. Okay, I told you we were going to cover this secondary thing about becoming more visible when we covered the things we like to fix, and here it is. The number one thing is become more visible. The number two thing is make room for these new board people that you're cultivating and recruiting. I'm not going to be a tired horse here. I'm just going to show you Exhibit A. As I traveled around the country, I made a habit in these small communities to pick up local newspapers and see what was moving out there. And this caught my attention. On the front page, above the fold, there was an article that talked about conservation districts. I said, wow, this is, well, I found out later why it was big news. And what I've done is I've masked this off so that I'm not revealing what state I was in whenever I was in a state of shock, I guess, what state this newspaper was bought in. And as I zoom in on the article, I have pasted over and will reveal the dialogue, and I have covered over with colored print the names of the places and the counties and the real names to protect these folks. You know, I'm sure that they were working on the way they were trained. So I'm not beating them up. I love them for their dedication. But let's just look at the article. The Hometown Conservation Districts Board has recently undergone several changes. In September, Billy Don announced his retirement as district board president. Billy Don, I knew a guy named Billy Don, so I used that, has served on the district board since 1974. Now, I'm a little mathematically challenged sometimes, so let me make that clear. This was printed in 2014, which means that Billy Don has served on that board 40 years. Kind of brings to mind Moses out in the wilderness, doesn't it? 40 years Billy Don's been on that board. So now he's retired. He's always been an amazing asset to the district board and the cause of conservation in this county and will be greatly missed. Who's going to take his place? The board has appointed Jim Bob, I know a guy named Jim Bob, to replace Billy Don as board president. Oh, the peaceful transfer of power is always tricky. Who is this upstart Jim Bob that's been on the board hardly any time, we think, who's going to be the new chair? Well, Jim has been with the district board since 1966. Yeah. Billy Don served 40 years on this 5-member board. And Jim Bob has served 48 years. And some of you are saying, well, why didn't somebody run against him? Come on. I think we've all had some real life experience and we kind of know how these things work. So what do you think? Do you think Jim Bob's going for his 50-year pin? Billy Don got his 40 pin. Previously, he served as the board's vice president. I don't know if they just didn't go into the books to look it up. You'd like to think in almost half a century that he had floated to the top a few times, but this just implies that he has previously been the vice president, which means in almost half a century, that's not, come on, please. All right, it goes on and says, Billy Don's departure left a vacant seat on the district board for which Mary Lou was appointed. During the October board meeting, Mary is a school teacher at the local high school. And the last paragraph now gives us now personnel-wise, and it reads this way. The board includes Jim Bob, president. Oh, George Jones, secretary, Tammy Wynette, Merle Haggard, and Mary Lou members, and Dolly Parton, office manager. I just kind of threw those names in there to make it interesting. That's not really who was there. But if it was those people, Don't you bet at the first board meeting they all stood up and sang, "Hello, Mary Lou." So there is a reference to make room and do it in a timely way. Remember the truck. It's your truck. Are you going to wear it out before you give it to the next and train them? All right. Number 5, failure to understand boards are elected or appointed to do governance. The paid staff, executive director and office manager, they are management. There is a difference between governance and management. Now, if you have no staff, then you have to take off your governance hat and put on your worker hat and take on the role of management. The way it was explained is governance will say there's got to be a parking lot built right there. And then you back out of the way and you let the executive branch who's executing that will, you don't try to go over and hover over them and tell them how to do their job. You have to monitor to make sure the job's being done, but there's a difference between that. And by the way, how many people do the management people answer to? Well, I'm a board member. They answer to me. Well, not exactly the way it works most efficiently. How would you like to have 5 different bosses who may be telling you 5 different things? How about this as a role model? Whoever the chair is, they gather the intelligence and they speak for the board. That way, staff has to deal with one person. There's nothing that has less power on a board than an individual board member. Tufts University taught me that. And there is nothing more powerful than the collective will of the board. If you let one person become that 500-pound gorilla, we'll talk about that in just a moment. Number 6, tendency for board members to sometimes get too involved in management, telling management how to do their job. You need to let them do their job. If they cannot do their job well, then it's probably time for a performance review and maybe freeing up someone's future so you can get someone else in there. But do not run your people off by constantly telling them how to do everything that's got to be done. And the same is true in reverse. The executive directors and staff sometimes do governance things. And sometimes that's by default. If the board won't be the brain, then some other part of the body takes over. That'll get you in trouble every time. This is my favorite picture. Of all the pictures I had to buy to do this, I love that one the most because I've seen that face at every organization's board that I've ever dealt with. And that's when they say, now what are we voting on? But they don't say it. They just have that look on their face. And that tendency has to be gotten past. You have to get past that awkward feeling of saying that. Could we slow down and explain to me what those initials mean? And while we're talking about initials, we all talk about the NRCS and NACD and NASCA. And when we do, we're becoming invisible in the same way that doctors and lawyers like to throw out all those acronyms, and it gives them the feeling that you don't know because you're not on the inside. Don't do that. Explain yourself when you're talking to people so that they know what those initials stand for. Just common courtesy. Number 9, failure to periodically distribute power. And power sometimes is different than the actual office positions. So think about where the power is on the board. There is something worse than a 500-pound gorilla, and that is a 500-pound angry gorilla. And if you have any of those on any of the boards, and I'm talking to Conservation District, but you serve on a lot of boards, you'll know this when you see it. And it's people who, through seniority, have felt like that their vote counts more, and people let that happen too often. You can tell whenever they always look at one direction before they vote to see how that person's going to vote. Have some courage. Number 10, unwillingness to publish an agenda and stick to it. You see, that should always be done before the board meets, and it will vastly cut down the amount of wasted time in board meetings if you just use that gavel politely, and when you see going off down the fence row, kind of pull them back and say, well, let's do this. And when we adjourn, we'll have another. Number 11, this old rubber stamp thing is still out there, and it will get you in trouble. It may be, even if you're going along with something bad and you don't look at it, it could be malfeasance. At the very least, it could be misfeasance or nonfeasance on your part. So give it some critical analysis. 12, a lack of promoting and advertising. What did I say? Sell the sizzle, spaced repetition, and ask for help. One of the most bravest things that you'll ever do as a leader is to humbly go to someone and say, I need your help. And you will be astonished at how much more help you get if you start with that question. A lack of willingness for board members to accept work assignments and chair committees. That's what being on the board is. It's not sitting around in the board meeting. There's a big difference between committee time and board time. You've got to pay the price and do some of that legwork. I tell people principles that don't cost you something aren't worth much. And I like this. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good women to do nothing. Yeah, Edmund let me do that. I'm sure if he was still alive. Good men, if he were more awakened today, he would realize that he should have worded that a little differently. 14, a failure to understand committee work is done, you see, outside the board meeting. If you want to lose your best board people, waste their time. And one of the number one waste of time is that when you should be getting the report of a committee on things. Remember, this is how Congress works. Many bills never get voted on in Congress because they fail in committee. If the committee doesn't think it's worth the time, it doesn't get out of committee. And that should be the same at your level. Let the committee do the work and then give a recommendation. And if they recommend doing something, well, then discuss it and vote. But don't say, we didn't ever get around to really talking as much about that as we wanted to, i.e. they didn't meet. We think this is something the whole board needs to talk about. And you can see people starting to stare down at their lap and check their email and do the text messaging because you're wasting their time. But you're not going to waste too much of their time. They will get out of there, I promise you. And that's just how you lose your best people. You cannot bore good board members or they will not be board members. 15, failure to understand. Primary purpose is to hear the results and recommendations and to make decisions. And then there's that tendency to just go along with the group. And you can tell who the courageous people are. When the lemmings start leaping off the edge of the cliff, if someone has the nerve and other anatomical needful things to stand up, and I could be talking about a backbone there, and say, whoa, wait a minute. And that does take courage. Wow. I love this cartoon. They went on and said, a leader is born. It went under their nose and they said, ooh, this is probably not a good idea. 17, a tendency to defer or should be acted upon promptly. Good old George Patton says, we need something that's good and we can do now. He said, a good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week. He understood timing. 18, repeated absence or tardiness of members for scheduled meetings. It's written right in the bylaws in most places. How about you? You have to meet so many times, and if you miss too many times without a real reason, a reasonable reason, then you've promised to follow the bylaws, and you just take that person aside and say, man, we really need you because we're bound by the law. That's why they call them bylaws. We're going to operate by law. We're bound by our bylaws that we can't have a board member who misses this many meetings, and they're probably looking for a reason to exit anyway, maybe, or maybe you'll be able to pull them back in. Absence and tardiness is prolific everywhere. I'm sure it's probably not a problem in Oklahoma. It is in other places, though. Deal with it. Your bylaws help you get rid of the deadwood. 19, unwillingness to read, review pertinent minutes, financial reports, all of that stuff before you get there. And with email, it's so easy. It just comes now. I've been in meetings, some of you, the mail was late. I think mine got lost in the mail. My computer's been down. Hey, have you got a copy of those minutes? I need to read through those right quick. And you see them reading through it when they should be paying attention. Let me tell you, If you approve the minutes and you haven't read them, you've just written history. Because if there's something in those minutes that's wrong, you've just told the judge, if it ever goes to that point, probably would never, that you verified that that's true. And there's going to be a lot of questions why you voted as a body to approve it if it was in the minutes. Very important thing to read the minutes. People think the chairman has power. I would suggest to you the secretary may have the most power because they are writing the history of the organization. Procrastinator, no. Save all my homework until the last minute because then I'll be older and therefore more wise. Doing things before they are due is important. Failure to understand, the board can delegate authority all day long. The board cannot delegate responsibility. That stays with the board. Just can't get rid of responsibility. And then remember, you are responsible for financial oversight. And there are places where conservation districts have gotten in trouble. If this helps bring it to realty, I found out there are law firms that only take fraud cases that deal with churches. And you know how that happens. Miss Janie has always kept the treasury, and it would be an insult to her if we had someone do an audit. And well, anyway, you're responsible. You're responsible for the finances. And then recognition that you can no longer just rubber stamp things, go home with a cup of coffee. Those days are over. We have flown through the things we'd like to fix about the board. The ship of democracy, which has weathered all storms, may sink through the mutiny of those on board. Grover Cleveland. I would just change one little thing and put the word in there, may sink through the mutiny of those on the board. He was talking about a ship. I'm talking about your truck. It's your truck. It's your truck. It's your truck. All right. So we're down to how to fix it before it fails. As usual, there are 3 parts to this: the plan, the pledge, and the promise. Here's the plan. The plan, you can see I'm into 3 things and alliteration. It's about how do you remember these? It's on your summary card, right? The plan starts with firm, good, clear board orientation. And I was working with a board in a faraway state from here several years back. And when I was going through how to do board orientation, I noticed one of the people was just kind of looking off, contemplating. And I called on him and said, "You look pretty thoughtful." He said, "Yeah, I'm just trying to picture what that would look like." Because he said, "We've never done that. People just kind of show up at the first board meeting, and after a while, i.e. the first couple of years, they kind of pick up on what we're doing." And he said, "I can see where it'd make a big difference if you had good board orientation. And you start 2 weeks before the first meeting. And you do it ideally with at least 2 board members. Don't put this off on staff and management. Show them that they're important. At least a couple of board members. You see, it's better than having 1 board member. Sit down with them, go over the mission, go over the purpose, buy them lunch." You might want to put that right at the top, actually. Review the bylaws. Go over the enabling legislation. You can these days just give them a thumb drive and say, "Hey, it's all on here." Meet with the relevant contacts, take them around, introduce them to the people, take them upstairs to the agencies above you, take them out to meet some of the people that you've helped in the past. Remember, your client is not just a handful of farmers and ranchers. You're who live in that watershed, in that district, in that conservation. They're the people who get the goods out of the truck, and then answer their questions. Give them a written description of everyone's job function. What a concept. You know, I do training sometimes for employees associations in conservation districts. And I remember one time I was speaking to one of those ladies during the break, asking her how their board worked. And she said, "Well, you know, they don't meet too much." She said, "Each one of them kind of has an area that they handle. And so whatever the problem is, we know which one we go and they tell us what to do." I thought, well, that's interesting. Once again, it proves that trucks will smoke and splutter and get you down the road. not very effective. Sometimes they wind up in the ditch. It's so much better when boards operate like boards should operate on. And I'm not being overcritical. I'm saying I've driven 8-cylinder and 6-cylinder trucks before that was missing a couple of cylinders. But one of the first things I ever drove was a 2-pop John Deere. You really know when you're missing a cylinder on one of those. So there's your plan. Go over the pledge. What's the second part? The pledge, and I've included one in your workbook, is just an example of the pledge. And I'm not going to read every bit of this. You've got it as an example. But it's a place where you sign your name. And I recommend every board member needs to pull out one of these at the first board meeting of the first of the year, read through it, talk about it, and sign it and date it and put it in file. And then you write your name, recognize the important responsibility that I've got. And you pledge that you're going to do this in a diligent, trustworthy manner. You understand your roles in the mission and helping plan for the organization, to carry out the work, to help develop policies. The distinction between what you are as organizational governance, as opposed to, if you have paid staff, what organizational management is, and pledge to do your side and help them do theirs. Do it with collegiality. I love that word. And being a high trustworthy person, a fiduciary. Put a high priority on attendance in meetings. You know, when you sign a document, have you ever closed on a house and signed so many papers? It makes a real impression on you about writing something down. Being prepared to discuss, reading things before you get to the meeting, respecting opinions, and keeping your personal prejudices out of things, to act for the good of the community, all the people in the district, to be supportive and positive, observe good parliamentary procedure. In the yellow pages, there's that little freebie thing you can get, a cheat sheet. You might look through that sometime. It really will help you kind of understand some good ways to, if you're missing a cylinder here or there, you'll still get down the road, but it's nice to replace that spark plug every once in a while. And let's see, refrain from intruding on other people's territory, other than to monitor to make sure things are being done right. Avoid conflicts of interest. Remember the inurement policy about making sure that just don't do anything that has to be hidden. If it has to be hidden, it shouldn't happen. With a few exceptions of going into executive meeting for personnel matters or something, be sure everything is above board. Refrain from voting on matters that you could have a personal interest in. That's where you recuse yourself, right? Be supportive at all times, even when you're in a minority position. And hear this. When you disagree with the rest of the board, you need to voice it, speak up, let it be on the record, and then vote what you understand. Be aware that you don't have to have a unanimous vote. It just takes the majority to pass. But when it passes, don't go drilling holes in their boat. It's your boat too. So once the discussion is over, if you didn't win, maybe you will be on the winning side next time, but you can't be undercutting what the board decides to do. The word sabotage comes from the Industrial Revolution, where people in Holland would take these sabots, these wooden shoes, like a monkey wrench in the works, and they would drop it in the cogs of the milling machine. They became known as saboteurs. Don't do that. When you're in a minority position, respect that fact. And if it's a matter of some kind of legal moral issue and you say, no, I'm against it, then not only do you vote against it, you need to look seriously now about moving yourself off of that board. It's one thing to disagree on just the principles of how to do something, but if it violates good ethic principles, just know who you are, what you stand for. On the task force, if you chair one of those committees, call the meetings, you're signing all this, have the agenda, conduct fair, orderly, efficient meetings, All of these things, you're going to participate in an annual strategic planning retreat. What would that look like? Participate in self-evaluation programs. How much have we hauled in our truck in the last 2 years? And what's the plan for hauling things in the truck? Develop good workshops and seminars. Going to enhance your skills as a board member. Be able to sign that. And when you do, date it. And man, when you go over that, people look at you like, you want me to sign that? Yes, we all sign. You see, it's the plan for the orientation. It's the pledge that you put your name to. And then the promise is basically, we're going to keep the law. We're going to respect our bylaws. We're going to respect all the laws of not only our organization, but the county, the state, and the feds. We're going to explain loyalty, due care, and obedience, because those three things are really the condensation of everything else I've talked about. Loyalty, due care, obedience. Talk about the fiduciary aspects, being faithful, attendance. The process for removal is right there in the promise, that we will act on that and tell them up front. That way they're not surprised when they hear it. And then you give them a copy of the bylaws again, all of the meetings, the preceding meetings, and answer their questions. Wow. You fix it before it fails with the plan, the pledge, and the promise. Which brings us to the last thing, how to play the unplayable piano. And again, I go to a TED Talk by Tim Hartford on how messy makes us creative. And I'd like you to travel in your mind back to 1975, a winter day, January 24th. Vera Brandes is she is the youngest concert arranger, programmer, promoter in the world at that time. She's 17 and her heart's on fire for jazz, and she does the remarkable thing. She talks the board of the Cologne Opera House. It's kind of like our Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., that if she could arrange for Keith Jarrett to come, since he was going to be not far away in Switzerland, would they allow him to have a midnight concert? And they said yes. And they sold out with tickets, and it was going to be great. She was so excited. I mean, there's the Cologne Opera House, hours away from filling it in this midnight presentation of this world pianist who plays jazz like no other person in the world. Keith Jarrett and his manager show up. He's not feeling too good. It's raining. His back hurts. He's wearing a brace. He walks in and things are not going well because Vera is showing him the piano. And he recognizes at a distance, that's not the piano I ordered. He recognizes that he ordered a Bosendorfer 290 Imperial. It has 97 keys, not just 88 keys. It has all full octaves. And he's looking at a Bosendorfer that was back behind the curtains, and there was a little mix-up. They thought that's what he wanted. And it wasn't a grand piano, it was a baby grand piano, and it was worn out, for crying out loud. The felts were worn on it, had a tinny register, some of the pedals didn't work, the black keys were sticking, and after about 2 or 3 minutes of hitting on a few keys, he mutters to his manager and says, manager tells Vera, unless you can get the piano we need, it's off. Keith can't play this. It's too small and it's absolutely out of shape. And she melted down. And she apologized, but they're hours away. And so Keith goes out and gets in his car. It's raining. She gets on the phone. There's no way to get the piano. They did get a tuner to come. He's working with a piece of junk, but he's going to do the best he can. And Vera goes out on the dock with rain pouring down, and she's begging. She's begging Keith Jarrett, world-renowned jazz pianist, please don't cancel. Please. What would you do? You'd beg. Keith Jarrett heard her, looked up, and said, never forget. Only for you. So Keith Jarrett went back in, they looked again at the piano. They realized that the best they could do would not be very good. But a few hours later, when the Cologne Opera House was packed, Keith Jarrett, without practice, without sheet music, it's jazz, right, walks out and sits down at that piano and begins to play. I'm sure you realize that Zoom is not made for the beautiful transmission of beautiful jazz. That's the best I could do. But let me tell you, the audience was galvanized because they realized they were witnessing something unique and unbelievable. And that machine was not big enough. And so what he did is he stood up at part of the times. You could hear the guttural moves of his diaphragm as he played in the middle register, which gave that piece an entirely different sound. He had to avoid the keys that didn't work. He didn't use the pedals that were sticking. To get the bass riffs, he had to stand up and really pound it out, but he had to do it with gentleness. And so people were mesmerized as he played in three parts, about an hour and a half. It's known as the Cologne concert. People were astonished. They gave him standing ovations. Not only did those people enjoy it, people to this day are enjoying that piece of music. It was recorded. It's called Keith Jarrett, the Cologne Concert. And I want you to know it is the top-selling piano recording of all time. It is not the top-selling piano recording of jazz or of music in the Cologne Concert House. No. Of all piano recordings since the beginning of piano recordings, it's the number one top-selling piano recording, and he was playing the unplayable piano. And that's all that we ask for you to do. Just learn to play the unplayable piano. The brilliant sons and daughters of Oklahoma deserve no less than the best of what you can deliver them. It's going to be their truck. Make arrangements today for it to be the best truck they'll ever have. Thank you. I know you'll succeed. I appreciate you. Love you. God bless. Bye-bye.